Hi, everybody. It's your Attorney General, Aaron Ford, and I am back with another episode of The State of Justice. Today, I'll be talking to Mark Krueger, who is the chief of my Consumer Protection Bureau, and also Matt Rashbrook, who is my financial fraud special prosecutor in the Criminal Prosecution Division. We'll be discussing fraud, scams, and schemes. In a perfect world, we would be able to trust everyone to deliver on the goods and services that they promise and not trick people out of their hard-earned money. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. So, as Attorney General, it's my responsibility to shield the people of Nevada from scams and deceptive trade practices. The economic challenges facing families today underscore the critical need for law enforcement to thwart any attempts to exploit our residents. Our primary line of defense in Nevada is the Consumer Protection Bureau, or my BCP, which is constantly tracking and alerting us to new scams being used to defraud Nevadans. In parallel, our dedicated team of prosecutors relentlessly pursues justice against those engaging in fraudulent activities, ensuring that they are held accountable within the confines of our legal system. But before we get into that discussion, I want to tell you about some of the work my office has been up to. Let's hash out the headlines. So you've seen some headlines about a lawsuit brought against the Secretary of State, and that lawsuit was challenging the constitutionality of the Election Worker Protection Act, which our legislature passed a couple of years ago. Well, my talented team of attorneys put forth a motion to dismiss that case, and the federal district court judge, Christina Silva, granted it. This case was important to us because it solidifies our efforts to protect election workers in our state. So anyone who would try to use force or to intimidate an election worker in connection with their election duties is committing a punishable crime. And this isn't just limited to physical threats. The law actually extends to someone who would even dox an election worker in connection with their election duties as well. And for those of you that don't know, doxing is searching for and publishing private or identifying information about a particular individual on the internet, typically with malicious intent. So this lawsuit and us prevailing in it sends a strong message that in Nevada, we take our elections seriously, and we're going to do everything that we can to not only protect the integrity of our elections, but also the safety of our election workers. You may have also seen a headline about a recent sting operation that my office engaged in related to sex trafficking. We do these operations frequently, and especially during big events in our city, which are typically accompanied by an increase in this form of criminal activity, among others. And as you know, just a couple of months ago, Las Vegas hosted Super Bowl 58. With all of the fanfare and festivities around that event, my investigators worked tirelessly to attack the presence of human and sex trafficking in our city. Considering the hundreds of thousands of people who came into the city for the Super Bowl, I'm pleased that the weekend came and went with no major incidences. However, we did come across an individual who attempted to solicit sex from a minor. Turned out he was actually soliciting one of our sting operators, an undercover officer who was posing as a child. So law enforcement was able to apprehend him. And thanks to my criminal prosecutors, this gentleman was sentenced to 19 to 48 months in prison. And I want to continue sending the message that anyone engaging in such criminal activity will be brought to justice. Now, let's get into today's topics: fraud, scams, and schemes. No one is immune from these types of activities, including yours truly. I frequently tell the story of my mother-in-law who on one occasion got a phone call supposedly from my son. And my son said to my mother-in-law he had been in a car accident, the police were on the scene, and that he needed to immediately pay $500 or some amount, and so that he didn't go to jail. Fortunately, my mother-in-law was savvy enough to know, let me call and check. And so she called me and she said, is Avery okay? And turned out Avery was just fine. He was not even in the place where they said the accident had taken place. And so we were able to protect her from falling prey to that type of scam and that type of scheme, which happens quite a bit. And you'll hear a lot more about that coming from the people who are talking to us today again, Mark and Matt. But again, these types of things happen to all of us. And that's why we're having this conversation today, to alert you to this fact and to help you protect yourself. Well, again, I'm here today with Mark Krueger, who is the chief of my Consumer Protection Bureau. and Matt Rashbrook, who is our Special Prosecutor for Consumer Issues, and excited to have this in-depth talk about this topic with you, both of you, because it seems like scammers are having a moment in the media these days. True crime really exploded in the podcast world, many of which have to do with scams and scammers, and it seems like almost every week one of the streaming services is releasing a new documentary or a docuseries about scammers. So this topic has really piqued the interest of people out there. Mark, I'm going to start with you. What are some of the quick stats you can give us about fraud in Nevada?
Thank you, General. Unfortunately, according to the Federal Trade Commission's Consumer Sentinel Network, which is a repository for complaints about scams, Nevada ranks number 3 for frauds and other scams. In addition, fraud losses in Nevada in 2023 were over $113 million.
Wow. Okay. So, Mark, that raises my next question. What are some of the scams that are most often reported to our office, and are there any particular schemes and scams that are on the rise?
General, that's a great question. We see a lot of different schemes and scams. Most recently, the AI-based scams. Those are usually based on relationships. We see a lot of gift card scams. Those are definitely on the rise. Romance scams have always been out there, and they tend to be one of the ones that we still see a lot of complaints about. A newer one is called cryptocurrency scams, in particular a pig butchering scam. There's also an imposter scams. Those tend to be a lot of complaints on imposter-based scams. And then most recently, we've also had some residential rooftop sales scams.
Yeah, I've heard about a lot of those coming through when I'm out and about in the community. People talk to me about this quite a bit. So I'm glad to hear that you are on top of these types of scams. But tell me, how elaborate are some of these schemes, and how are these scammers able to defraud people?
Well, in general, the scams can be very elaborate. They can also be very simple. The elaborate ones, especially the AI-based ones, actually oftentimes use people's voices to trick individuals into thinking that they're actually talking to their child or their loved one. Mm-hmm. And that's how they're actually able to make the scam work and gain your personal identifying information or money from you.
Yeah. So are there particular groups that are more vulnerable than others? I mean, who are they targeting with these types of scams?
General, I hate to say it depends, but it does depend on the type of scam. Some groups are targeted because, the type of scam comes out of a bank account imposter scam. They're going to be targeting anybody with a bank account. But sadly, older adults tend to be truly the ones that are targeted the most.
And in that regard, you kind of mentioned it earlier, but tell the listening audience here what you think a consumer's first line of defense is in protecting themselves from these types of scams.
Well, General, you and I have talked about it before, and it's that sense of urgency that's created in these scams. You just got to pause, and we've said it many times. Take a pause for a minute, evaluate, talk to a trusted loved one, friend, and see whether or not they think it's a scam. Hang up. Call the number back directly to the institution that's supposedly calling you. Those types of things. But it's always that pause, that initial moment to just evaluate, hey, wait a minute, am I getting scammed or is this legit?
That makes a lot of sense. And, we are one of the agencies that people can report to when they're being scammed. I know we have local agencies as well, but there's one at the federal level called the Federal Trade Commission, and that's the federal agency that's tasked with protecting the public from deceptive or unfair business practices. Does our office work with the Federal Trade Commission or the FTC or other states to increase awareness about scams or schemes?
Yes, General. Our office works very closely with the FTC. We do it 2 ways. One, we work in conjunction in doing presentations. We do co-authored or co-branded education and awareness publications. But we also do it in another way, and that is we actually take enforcement actions where we can with the FTC and with other states.
Yeah. So the people know when and where should they report their consumer complaints.
You said earlier, General, we take complaints. FTC takes complaints. The FBI IC3 takes complaints. The bottom line is, no matter where you complain, if we feel that it also could, you could be benefited from one of these other agencies, we'll forward your complaint on. So absolutely go to the Attorney General's website and file a complaint with us, or the FTC's website and file a complaint with them.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to bring in Matt's perspective as our special prosecutor. So, Matt, can you, you are our special prosecutor for financial crimes. Can you talk a little bit about the office and how we determine if a complaint will be handled as a civil matter or as a criminal matter?
So really what I would say is that we are governed by the facts of a given case. And when a constituent comes to us with a complaint, the matter's investigated, and eventually Mark and I generally will have a conversation about each and every case, and we get together and talk about what evidence we have and whether it fits the law for criminal or civil fraud. And those are very, very similar in a lot of cases. But there's a different burden of proof, and in criminal cases a more demanding burden of proof. And so we have to wait and see where the facts take us, and that really is what governs us on whether a case is handled criminally or civilly.
I see. You know, these things are happening all over the place, and they're happening to everybody. Earlier this year, a prominent financial columnist for New York Magazine wrote about how even she was tricked into withdrawing $50,000 from her bank account and handing it over to a complete stranger, get this, in a shoebox. What this reiterates to me is that, again, any of us could fall victim to a scam artist. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways crimes like this are carried out?
Well, I think it's exactly what Mark referred to earlier. It is so common to these scams or schemes that the perpetrator impersonates somebody, and that's either somebody in your life that you trust, or it's somebody in public or in sort of the public consciousness that we're trained to trust, that they're a figure of authority. Either they'll impersonate someone from your bank, or they'll impersonate a law enforcement figure, and that's sort of a combination of what happened in that case where the financial columnist Miss Cowles was called by somebody who was impersonating a worker for Amazon, and then she's connected to another person who's impersonating law enforcement, another person who's impersonating another agency.
Wow.
And they all sort of come with these badges of trust, and these are people that we trust in our everyday interactions, because sometimes I get a phone call from a banker, or you get a text message from a loved one. And those are, I think, the really common ways that the perpetrators get access to you and get you to take the phone call or to respond to them. And from there, it's these incremental, they get a little bit more trust from you and a little bit more trust from you. And we see that in some of our cases where initially there's a small dollar transaction, and then a larger one and a larger one over time, and that people, and it's so sad, but they end up getting taken multiple times, and that, of course, is psychologically and emotionally painful. It makes them even more reluctant to report,
Right.
and the losses amount, and it really does just spiral at that point.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned that Ms. Cowles, she's the New York columnist I was talking about, and the scheme they used with her was very elaborate, going back to what I was talking to with Mark a minute ago. So, you know, knowing how these crimes are carried out, Matt, how does the Attorney General's office use that information to warn consumers?
Yeah, it's a critical part of the public education campaign that we have to do to educate people on, hey, you all should know these scams are out there, and if somebody calls you and says they're a CIA agent, you should really question that. And I think that's one of the big public education aspects for us, is when these people are trying to pull off these scams so commonly, they want to isolate you from the people that you should by all means talk to. And that's, don't talk to your husband, don't call a trusted friend, don't talk to your attorney or to your banker or whoever that might be. And to Mark's point earlier, that's what we would really encourage people is take a beat, call that person. Of course you can trust your spouse, your loved one, your advisors, your friends. Of course you can trust those people. And in Ms. Cowles' case, they frightened her out of making those phone calls.
Right.
And she, when in telling the story, she talks about, I knew this was wrong. I knew I shouldn't have trusted these people, but they convinced her not to make those phone calls, not to take that time and ask those questions. So I think that's what we really want to educate the public on, is trust yourself. If you have a sense that this is really not on the level and not trustworthy, listen to that voice and call a loved one, call somebody you trust, and hopefully that's going to be the thing that helps you recognize this is not a trustworthy, this is not a safe transaction.
That's very good advice, and in fact, goes back to the story I told earlier about my mother-in-law getting that phone call from my son. She called me from my son. I put that in print in quotes, right, because it wasn't from my son. But she called me to double check and be certain that it, in fact, wasn't him, and that she was able to avoid being scammed in that regard. Now, look, I'm proud of what you do. I'm proud of what Mark does. I'm proud of our investigators who investigate all of these crimes, but they are hard to prosecute. And we have a very tough time doing it. Why is it, Matt, that these are so hard to prosecute?
Well, it's the nature of how they are perpetrated is these people are impersonating others, and so it can be very hard for us to identify. It's very hard for us to follow the money. And that is one thing that I would flag for people is if you're on the phone with somebody or you're getting text messages from somebody and they are insisting that you use a gift card for payment, or that you must pay in cash, or these other kinds of payments that can't be reversed, where there's no safety features, there's no passwords attached, that's a big red flag. Where if you're buying something from a legitimate business, they're happy to take a credit card payment.
Right.
They're not going to insist that you use some untraceable gift card. That to me is a big red flag, and unfortunately that's one of the things that makes it very difficult for us to prosecute. Is it's difficult for us, A, to identify the people, use very sophisticated technology to conceal their true identity, and then B, it's very difficult for us to follow the money and rebuild those transactions. So the plus side of that is that those do give us points we can educate the public on and hopefully help people identify those scams before they're taken in.
Yeah, so you've detailed some of the difficulties in prosecuting it, and I know some will feel discouraged about prosecuting, about reporting it. But tell us, why should a consumer still tell us if there are crimes, if these crimes are so hard to commit, or to prosecute?
Well, what I would say is they're not impossible to prosecute, and we're here to help you and to try to put that evidence together, and we're going to work very hard to do that. And as you said, we have some excellent investigators, we have excellent attorneys in the office, and we are eager to prosecute these people and to put these people out of business. And even failing that, by coming forward, you educate us on the scams and schemes that are out there, and we can in turn educate the public and provide those bulletins and provide that, hey, look, and you and Mark talked about this earlier, these AI schemes that are proliferating so quickly. And the only way we can turn and educate the public is if the constituents come to us and trust us with that information, and then we can relay it and hopefully broadcast that to the people that need to know.
Yeah, now we got to start wrapping it up. But look, like I said, I know I've been scammed before. My mother-in-law has been scammed, or they've tried to. Have you ever been scammed, Matt?
I've barely escaped.
Barely escaped.
Truly, I barely escaped. An attorney that I worked with, who I really, really admired, and I got an email from his account, and I knew that was his email account. And I got an email saying, hey, buddy, we haven't talked in ages, but I'm in the hospital. I'm dying of boredom. Could you go get me an iTunes gift card, and I'll settle up with you when I'm out of here, because I got no movies to watch. Send me $100 on an iTunes gift card and let me get some movies.
Wow.
And I was so lucky because I had exchanged a million emails with this person, and I knew his writing. And when I read the email, I just thought, this doesn't sound like him. And even then I thought, well, he's in the hospital, he's not feeling well.
Right.
So maybe that explains why it doesn't sound like him. But I called the office and I said, hey, is this person in the hospital? And I was told, no, he's sitting 10 feet away from me.
Wow.
And I said, okay, you can let him know that his email's been compromised.
Wow. What about you, Mark? You ever been scammed before?
I have not been scammed, General, but we actually had an attorney in the Bureau of Consumer Protection whose significant other very nearly was scammed. And this particular attorney was at home. Her significant other runs downstairs and says, I gotta go. I'll be right back in just a few minutes. He runs to a local store and purchases gift cards. he comes back and he's madder than ever. He's just saying how the person, the attendant, a cashier at the store told him, be careful about buying gift cards because scammers oftentimes use them. And he was like so mad because he's like, it's no right of that cashier to tell me this. Now they're trained to do that, by the way, General. That's actually something they are trained to do. And she goes, wait a minute, why are you buying gift cards? He goes, because my boss just sent me an email that said that I need to grab some gift cards for some gifts and I better do it ASAP. Again, that sense of urgency, the fear factor, I don't want to get fired, and quickly give it to her. And she goes, wait a minute, I think this is a scam. So, but for the fact that he was very upset with the cashier for doing the job, he would have been taken.
Yeah, well, we've heard about that scam before, in fact. I mean, we've gotten that right here in town ourselves. Look, we're going to close it out, but Mark, if you have one piece of advice you can give our listeners, what would it be?
General, it would be to pause. It would be to take a moment and think about what's going on. Realize that maybe there isn't a sense of urgency. Talk to a trusted loved one, friend, and see what they think. And when you do that, when you just pause for a minute, it sometimes brings it back to the point where you can go, wait, this might be a scam.
Great advice. Matt, what about you? What piece of advice would you give them? One piece.
If you are taken in by a scam or you fear you have been, please report it to us. We want to investigate these cases. They're difficult cases, but they're not impossible. We want to investigate these cases, and if nothing else, you will help us educate the public so that others are not taken in.
Again, great advice. Listen, you both shared so much today, and I know we've only scratched the surface on this topic, and I'm probably going to need to bring you both back to do a follow-up on this conversation. Regardless, I'm sure that our listeners will find this information that you were able to unpack today extremely useful. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, Matt, for stopping by.
Thank you. We're happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks very much for having us.
Well, that's it for episode 3 of the State of Justice podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to like it, to share it, and even leave your comments on this episode. And stay tuned for episode 4, where we will be discussing more on consumer protection on social media. It's another conversation that I'm excited to have and to bring awareness to the public. So thanks again for listening, and goodbye. This podcast was created for educational and informational purposes only. The thoughts and commentary expressed in this podcast are provided as a service to the community and do not constitute solicitation or provision of legal advice. This podcast is not designed to provide specific legal advice and should not be used as a substitute for competent legal advice from a licensed professional attorney. The use of any podcast material does not create an attorney-client relationship with the Nevada Attorney General or any attorneys employed by the Office of Attorney General or podcast guests. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the Nevada Attorney General. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on this program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent by the Nevada Attorney General or the state of Nevada.